There is something dangerous that many people do every day without realizing it. They hand over control of their emotional state to anyone. All it takes is one criticism, an ignored message, or a bad face to ruin their entire day. And I learned this by observing something very simple between Japan and Latin America. In Japan, I saw people withstanding pressure without emotionally destroying themselves. And in Latin America, I saw a lot of talent being lost by reacting to everything. Then I understood something. Life doesn't always destroy you because of the blows you receive, but because of the importance you give them. The day you learn to act calmly even when something hurts, you begin to re-control of your life. There are people who live convinced that ours comes from what happened to this and to them. But many times the suffering doesn't come from the event. It comes from the interpretation they made of the event. And that completely changes the way you understand life. Because look, two people can experience exactly the same situation and come out completely different. Someone gets rejected for a job and thinks, I'm useless. Another gets rejected and thinks, I need to prepare myself better. The event was the same. The interpretation was different. And the interpretation ended up defining each person's future. I grew up watching two completely different cultures. In one culture, I learned discipline, order, and emotional resilience. In the other, I saw joy, creativity, and human closeness. But I also saw something that was repeated a lot. People destroying themselves emotionally, not because of what was happening, but because of the meaning they gave to what was happening. Someone didn't say hello. They must be upset with me. Someone corrected a mistake. They're humiliating me. A relationship ended. I'll never be enough for anyone. And little by little, the mind begins to build a story that isn't even based on reality, but on fear. Old insecurities and old wounds. I remember one time when I was young and someone criticized me very harshly after a conference, and it wasn't the criticism that affected me the most. What affected me was what I thought afterwards. Because the mind starts to exaggerate. Maybe everyone thinks the same. Maybe I'm not good at this. Maybe I should just quit. And you realize something amazing. A comment lasted 10 seconds, but I was willing to suffer for it for weeks. Then I understood something that changed the way I live. The mind is an interpreter. It never receives facts in a pure way. It always translates them. And if you don't educate that interpretation, you're going to live reacting to ghosts that you yourself created. That's why there are people who live emotionally tired, not because their life is harder, but because they turn every small problem into a huge threat. And the more they feed that interpretation, the more real it becomes inside them. There are people who waste entire years trying to change what others said about them. Listen to me carefully. You will never have control over what people say, but you can have control over the meaning you decide to give to their words. And the day you understand that, you begin to regain power. Because then criticism stops being destruction and becomes information. A rejection stops being humiliation and becomes direction. A failure stops being the ending and becomes training. Life changes when the interpretation changes, because it's not always what happened. What often breaks you is the story you tell yourself afterwards. There are people who believe that having character means reacting strongly, raising your voice, responding immediately, showing that no one can walk all over them. But over the years, I've come to understand something completely different. Reacting to everything is power is losing. Control that. Because when any comment changes your mood, when any criticism ruins your day, when any provocation manages to throw you off center, then someone else is controlling your emotions. Is a person who doesn't control their emotions ends up making wrong decisions, even if they're very talented. I remember something I saw a lot when I was young. In difficult environments, people reacted quickly because they thought that staying silent was weakness. If someone offended you, you had to respond louder. If someone pushed you, you had to hit back. And it seemed like strength, but it wasn't. It was impulsiveness disguised as character. I discovered true strength by observing people who could remain calm under pressure. People who didn't need to prove anything at every moment. People who understood that not every battle is worth fighting. Because there are people who are tired all the time, not because they work too much, but because they overreact. They react to traffic. They react to other people's opinions. They react to social media. They react to a glance. They react to a message that didn't get through, and each reaction consumes energy. Oh God, little by little, the mind wears down until they live in permanent tension. I once met a Japanese man who worked under a lot of pressure. I expected to see him stressed out, desperate, but he's sad away, but he was incredibly calm. And one day I asked him how he managed to stay that way. I'll never forget what he said to me. He replied, "If I react to everything, I end up being a slave to everything." That phrase hit me hard because many people believe they are free, but they live emotionally dependent on what happens outside. If they are congratulated, they are fine. If they are ignored, they are destroyed. If everything goes perfectly, they smile. If something goes wrong, they lose their peace. That is not stability. That is emotional fragility. And here is the problem. When you react impulsively, you almost always give up control of the situation. Because reacting quickly usually means acting from a place of hurt, not from intelligence. That is why later on, the words you regret, the relationships you broke out of pride, the opportunities you missed out on because of the bridges you burned because of an emotional moment appear. Calmness does not mean that you do not feel. It means that your emotions no longer make decisions for you. And that requires discipline, a lot of discipline, because human beings have the natural impulse to defend themselves immediately. But the strongest people I have met are not the most aggressive ones. They are those who have learned to stop before responding. They breathe, observe, process, and then decide. That is completely life-changing because when you scare to everything, you begin to choose your battles, your words, and your thoughts better. And the day you stop reacting automatically, you regain something that many have lost long ago, control over yourself. Over time, I understood something that completely changed the way I live. Energy is limited, and the problem with many people isn't that they lack talent, ability, or dreams. The problem is that they waste all their energy on things that don't deserve it. There are people who are emotionally exhausted from useless arguments, people who are mentally tired from trying to convince those who have already decided not to understand them, people who reach the end of the day without energy. Not because they worked on something big, but because they wasted their minds on small worries. And that's dangerous, because one thinks that energy is only lost in physical effort, but no. Energy is also drained by repetitive thoughts, silent resentments, and wanting to control. What does it say then? A vehicle depend on one. I remember that during a stage in my life, criticism affected me a lot. Even if I received 100 positive comments, if one negative one appeared, all my attention would go there, and without realizing it, I would start dedicating entire hours to something that the other person probably wrote in less than a minute. And one day, I understood something absurd about that situation. There were people building their dreams while I was wasting my energy trying to process opinions that weren't going to change my destiny, Satani. That's when I understood that not everything deserves to enter your mind, because the mind works like a house. If you let just anyone in, sooner or later you'll lose your peace within it. There are people who let everyone's opinion in. One comment can change their mood. One comparison can rob them of their peace of mind. One criticism can destroy their confidence. And so they live emotionally available to anything negative that happens outside. But strong people learn something different. They learn to filter, not because they are cold, not because they don't have feelings, but because they understand that protecting their energy is also a form of intelligence. Look at this. If your cell phone has 5% battery, you're not going to waste it on useless apps. You're going to take care of what's left because you know you need that energy for something important. So why do we do the opposite with our emotional life? We waste energy on arguments that contribute nothing, on people who've already decided to misunderstand us, on memories that can no longer be changed, on situations that happened years ago, and continue to occupy mental space today, mental space. And in the meantime, the important thing waits for your project and tags, waits for your children, waits for your peace, waits for the life you could build if you stop feeding so much what destroys you. I learned by observing very different cultures that the most emotionally disciplined people are not those who have the fewest problems. They are those who know where to put their attention. Because where you put your attention is where you put your energy, and where you put your energy is where you build your life. That's why there are people who thrive even in difficult times and others who live trapped even though everything around them seems fine. Mahoda. It all depends on what they feed each day. There are battles that simply aren't worth the emotional drain. There are people who don't deserve any more explanation. There are situations that need a solution, not obsession. And the day you understand that, something changes inside you. You start to walk lighter, sleep more peacefully, and think more clearly because you finally understood that not everything is worth your energy. There's something that many people don't understand until much later. Calmness isn't just an emotion. Calmness is a way of training the mind in the mind. Because most people believe that they must first feel calm in order to act calmly. But many times it's the other way around. First, you decide to act calmly, and then your mind begins to transform. I learned this by observing people under extreme pressure, people working for hours in silence, solving enormous problems, without getting enormous problems, without getting desperate, without shouting, without losing control. And at first I thought they were simply different, but no. What they had was emotional training, because can also be practiced. I remember a time in my life when any problem upset me a lot. If something didn't go as expected, I would get frustrated quickly. If someone criticized me, I would spend days thinking about it. And then the problem wasn't just the situation. The problem was that mind had become accustomed to reacting immediately. And the mind works the same as the body. What you repeat constantly becomes stronger. If you react with anger every day, your mind learns anger. If you worry every day, your mind learns anxiety. If you dramatize problems every day, your mind learns chaos. But the opposite also happens. When you start breathing before responding, your mind learns pause. When you decide to stay calm in difficult moments, and your mind learns stability. When you choose to think clearly, instead of despairing, your mind begins to change. That's why calmness is so powerful. Because a calm mind sees solutions that an upset mind can never see. Look, when the water is rough, you can't see the bottom. But when the water calms down, everything becomes clear. The same thing happens with the human mind. Most bad decisions aren't made due to a lack of intelligence. They're made due to a lack of calm. Intelligent people destroying relationships on impulse. Capable people abandoning projects out of desperation. Talented people losing opportunities because they didn't know how to handle pressure. And something that really struck when comparing culture was understanding that emotional discipline can completely change the way a person faces life. In many places, people expect to be motivated to act correctly, but emotionally. Strong people understand something different to sandararo nasi. You can't always control how you feel, but you can control how you decide to act. When you sustain that practice over a long period of time, your mind reorganizes itself. You start to stop reacting so intensely. You start to think more clearly under pressure. You start to feel less need to prove something, and then something incredible happens. The same situations that used to destroy you now barely move you. Not because life is easier. Not because the problems have disappeared, but because your mind no longer responds the same way. Calmness changes your perception. It changes your decisions. It changes your body. Even because a person at peace thinks differently, speaks differently, and lives differently. And here's the most important thing. Calmness does not mean the absence of emotions. It means that emotions no longer rule your life. That is maturity, because anyone can lose control. But very few people can maintain clarity when everything around them seems to be in disarray. And that ability can completely change your destiny. Because the mind that learns to remain calm also learns to remain strong. Arung. There is something that society greatly admires but understands very little. Power. And usually when people hear that word, they think of money, influence, authority, opposition. But over the years, I have discovered that there is a form of power that is much more difficult to achieve and much more valuable. Emotional discipline. Because controlling a company can be impressive. Controlling other people can seem strong, but controlling your emotions when you are hurt, frustrated, or under pressure, that does require real power. Most people are governed by what they feel at the moment. If they love, they act. If they get angry, they explode. If they get frustrated, they quit. If they feel insecure, they become paralyzed. And then their entire life becomes unstable because it depends on emotions that are constantly changing. That is why there are people with enormous talent who never build anything lasting. Not because they lack ability, they lack emotional discipline. I remember something I observed many times in very different cultures. They were extremely intelligent people, but they were incapable of sustaining long processes because they quickly became demotivated. Then I also saw people who were perhaps less talented, but emotionally disciplined, consistent, capable of pushing forward even when they didn't feel like it. And it was almost always those people who ended up growing the most kayuasha. Because success rarely belongs to the most excited. It usually belongs to the most stable hasha. Emotional discipline means doing the right thing even when your emotions want to take you somewhere else. It means keeping quiet when you want to explode. It means continuing when you want to quit. It means thinking before you react. It means staying the course even when your mood changes. And that's not easy because emotions are intense. Sometimes pride tells you to respond immediately. Sometimes sadness tells you to shut down. Sometimes fear tells you to quit before trying. But an emotionally disciplined person understands something important. Not everything you feel deserves to be turned into action. I had moments where I felt like responding to criticism, defending myself, proving others was wrong, and many times silence was harder for me. But I learned something over time. Not every provocation is worth your energy, and many times responding from emotion only makes things worse. Emotional discipline is also evident in everyday life. It shows in those who keep working even when no one applauds them, in those who maintain respect even when others don't, in those who can listen to criticism without breaking down, in those who go through difficult times without turning their pain into destruction for others. That's real strength, because anyone can act correctly when everything is going well. True character emerges when emotions want to dominate you and you still choose to act intelligently. And here's something very important. Emotional discipline doesn't mean repressing what you feel. It doesn't mean Pretending that nothing affects you, it means that your emotions no longer make decisions for you. You listen to them, you process them, but you don't hand them the steering wheel of your life. Because if every emotion directs your path, you'll end up changing direction every day, and that's how you'll never build anything solid. The strongest people I've met aren't the coldest or the hardest. They're the most stable. People who are able to maintain clarity in the midst of chaos. People who don't need to react impulsively to feel strong. And when you develop that discipline, something changes deeply inside you. You stop being a slave to the moment. You stop depending so much on external things. You stop destroying what is important for fleeting emotions. Because the true freedom begins when you learn to govern yourself. Many times we believe that we react to what is happening today, but that is not true. We react to something much older and understanding. That can completely change the way you see your life, because there are people who fall apart due to a small criticism, not because of the criticism itself, but because that criticism touches a wound that has existed for years. There are people who feel an enormous fear of rejection, not because of the current situation, but because at some point in their life, they felt abandoned, ignored, or insufficient. And then the present activates the past. That explains why two people experience exactly the same situation and react to completely differently. One is corrected and learns. Another is corrected and feels that they are being destroyed. The problem is not always what happened. The problem is often the wound that it awakened. I remember meeting very talented people who reacted with enormous intensity to small situations. At first, I thought they were exaggerating. Then I understood that they weren't just reacting to the present moment. They were reacting to years of accumulated insecurity, fear, or pain that they had never learned to process properly. And that also forced me to observe myself. There were times in my life when certain opinions affected me too much more than normal. And when I began to analyze it honestly, I discovered that it wasn't just because of what people said. It was because those words connected with doubts that I already got inside me. That happens a lot. If deep down someone believes that they are not enough, any rejection will seem like confirmation. If someone has a wound of abandonment, any emotional distance will feel like a loss. If someone grew up feeling unappreciated, any criticism will sound louder than it really is. And that's why there are people who live constantly on the defensive, not because they are bad, but because they carry open wounds trying to survive. And here's the dangerous thing. When you don't understand your wounds, they start to control your reactions without you realizing it. So you explode over small things, shut down. You shut down emotionally too quickly. You distrust even those who want to help you, or you constantly seek approval because there is something inside you that still feels insufficient. And many people spend their entire lives blaming only what happens outside, without realizing that much of their suffering comes from wounds that were never properly addressed. But I want to clarify something important. Acknowledging a wound is not playing the victim. It is taking responsibility, because you cannot heal something that you pretend does not exist. And healing requires courage. A lot of courage, because it is easier to blame the world than to look inward. It is easier to say everyone hurts me than to ask yourself why certain things affect you so much. Emotionally mature people begin to ask themselves different questions. Why did I react this way? What part of me felt threatened? Does this really have to do with today, or has it been going on for a long time? And when you do that internal work, something changes profoundly. You begin to react less. You begin to understand yourself better. You begin to separate the present from the past. Because many times the problem isn't today's commento. It's the old wound that's still talking inside you. And until you heal that, you'll keep giving your peace to any situation that touches that scar. Many people believe that peace is living without problems. They think they'll have peace when the difficulties disappear, when everything goes well, when no one criticizes them, when life finally falls into place the way they want it to. But life doesn't work that way. Problems change form. Difficulties appear and disappear. People disappoint. Plans fail. If your peace depends on everything outside being perfect, then you will never have true peace. Over time, I understood something much deeper. Peace isn't controlling everything that happens. Peace is learning to control how you respond to what happens. And that completely changes your life. Because two people can go through the same problem and one is emotionally destroyed while the other maintains clarity, dignity, and direction. Not because it doesn't hurt. Not because they're cold, but because they've learned to respond differently. I remember times when things didn't go as expected. Projects that didn't work out, unfair criticism, people misinterpreting my intentions. And at first, like many, I wanted to control everything. I wanted to correct every opinion, defend myself from every attack, immediately fix every uncomfortable situation. But living like that is exhausting because the more you try to control the outside world, the more anxiety you accumulate inside. And one day, I understood something by observing emotionally strong people. Most of them didn't have easy lives. They had responsibilities, pressure, real problems. But there was something different about them. They didn't let circumstances automatically decide their inner state. That's peace. The ability to maintain stability even when the environment changes. And look, anyone can smile when everything is going well, but true peace appears when something goes wrong and you still don't lose control of yourself. When someone disrespects you and you choose not to lower yourself, when a problem arises and you choose to think before despairing, when emotions run high, but you don't let them rule your decisions, it takes a lot of strength because the natural impulse is to react immediately, to defend yourself, to explode, to dramatize, to close your heart to. But mature people understand something that transforms their way of living. There is a space between what happens and your response. And in that space lies your freedom. There you decide who you really are. I learned a lot by observing the emotional discipline of people who could remain calm under pressure, not because they didn't feel fear or frustration. Of course they did, but they had developed the ability not to become slaves to every momentary emotion. And that changes everything. Because a person who controls the response thinks more clearly, speaks better, makes better decisions, builds healthy relationships, and destroys their own life less over fleeting impulses. There are people who ruin years of work because of 5 minutes of anger. There are people who lose valuable relationships because they never learn to manage their emotions. And then they think the problem was the situation, when in reality the problem was the way they responded to it. That's why peace is not weakness. Peace is internal control. It is being able to look at chaos without becoming chaos yourself. And when you develop that ability, something changes deeply inside you. You no longer depend so much on what happens out and outside to keep you stable inside. Because you finally understand that life will not always be under your control, but your response to it can be. And that is where true peace begins. There is a phrase that can make many people uncomfortable, but it needs to be understood. Whoever controls your emotions controls your life or regime. And that many people give up that control every day without realizing it, icing it. A comment changes their mood. An opinion destroys their confidence. An ignored message steals their peace. A criticism completely changes their day, and so they live That is not emotional freedom. That is dependency. I remember seeing many times extremely capable people completely lose control over small things, intelligent people who made bad decisions just because someone touched their pride. And there I understood something important. It doesn't matter how talented you are if anyone can manipulate your emotional state, because one knows exactly what to say to make you explode, to make you insecure, to throw you off center. That person has power over you. that person has power over you, even if you don't realize it. And this happens everywhere. It happens in relationships where one person emotionally manipulates the other. It happens at work where someone is constantly seeking approval. It even happens on social media, where a negative opinion can destroy someone's peace of mind for days. The question is, how can a single situation control your inner life so much? The answer is almost always the same, because we haven't learned to control our emotions. And I want to clarify something. Controlling your emotions doesn't mean stopping feeling. It means that what you feel no longer automatically determines how you act, because there are people who are emotionally available to any provocation. If someone flatters them, they get too high. If someone criticizes them, they get too destroyed. If someone rejects them, they feel like losing value. And so they end up handing the keys to their emotional stability to the behavior of others. I remember once someone tried to provoke me publicly, and inside I felt like responding immediately to Bunny. I wanted to defend myself, to prove him wrong. But as I listened, I thought of something important. If I react exactly as this person expects, then I have already lost. Because many people provoke seeking precisely that, to control your reaction, but won't. And when you understand that, you begin to look at life differently. You begin to realize that not every provocation needs a response. Not every criticism deserves attention. Not every opinion has authority over your identity. Emotionally strong people understand that their peace is worth too much to give away so easily. That's why they don't react to everything. That's why they don't get desperate so quickly. That's why they can remain calm even when others try to destabilize them. And that's not coldness. That's internal control. Because when you control your emotions, you choose your decisions. But when others control your emotions, they also end up influencing your decisions, your relationships, and even your destiny. There are people who have given up on dreams because someone made fun of them. There are people who have destroyed relationships out of momentary pride. There are people who have stopped believing in themselves because of words that should never have had so much power. And that's why you need to learn to protect your mind. You can't stop the world from having an opinion. You can't stop someone from trying to hurt you. You can't control everything that happens inside of you, but you can decide how much access those things have to your insides. And the day you stop reacting automatically to every external stimulus, you regain something that's worth more than any recognition: control over your own life. Because no one should have so much power over you that they can control your emotions from the outside. There's something that few people truly understand. Your attention is one of the most valuable things you have. Because what you give it your attention to begins to take up space inside of you, and over time, that the space ends up shaping your reality. That's why two people can live in the same place, go through similar difficulties, and still experience completely different lives, because they don't live solely according to what's happening outside. They live according to what they constantly focus their minds on. There are people who have trained their attention to find problems in everything. They see rejection in every silence. They see failure in every mistake. They see threat in every difficulty. And the more attention they give it, the bigger it becomes inside of them. I remember times in my life where I was so focused on the negative that I stopped seeing everything else. It only took a small problem to completely steal my peace. And even though there were opportunities, good people, or valuable things happening around me, my mind was only caught up in what bothered me. And that's when I understood something important. Wherever you put your attention, you put your energy, and wherever you put your energy, you end up building your life. Because the mind works like a filter. It starts looking for more of what you constantly feed. If you feed resentment, you'll find more reasons to be resentful. If you feed fear, you'll start seeing danger everywhere. If you feed insecurity, any situation will seem like a threat. That's why there are people who live emotionally exhausted, even though objectively their lives aren't destroyed. Their attention is trained to focus only on the negative, and today's world is constantly making that worse. Social media competes for your attention. The news competes for your fear. Many people compete to provoke your reaction, and if you don't learn to consciously direct your attention, you will end up living according to whatever is making the most noise outside. Observing different cultures, I understood something very interesting. People who are more mentally disciplined do not necessarily have fewer problems. They simply learned not to give everything the same weight. That completely changes life, because there are people who turn a mistake into a learning experience. And there are people who turn a mistake into identity. One thinks, I made a mistake. The other thinks, I am a failure. The event was the same. The tension was different. That is why you need to take deep care of what you consume every day, yang tari. The conversations you overhear, the people you hang out with, the thoughts you repeat, then have, all of that feeds your mental focus. And something very dangerous happens when your attention gets trapped in pain for too long. You start to constantly relive situations, replay conversations in your head, imagine negative scenarios over and over again. And while you do that, life keeps moving forward without you. There are dreams waiting for your energy. There are people waiting for your presence. There are opportunities waiting for your focus. But your mind is trapped to feeding something that has already happened, or something that may never happen. Attention is also a form of power. Because what you choose to ignore begins to lose strength within you, and what you choose to reassess begins to grow. That is why some people live trapped in bitterness for years, while others manage to rebuild themselves even after very difficult times. It is not that some suffered less. It is that they learned to direct their attention differently. And the day you understand that, you begin to regain control over your mind, because you finally discover that your reality is not built solely by what happens to you, but by what you decide to give importance to each day. For a long time, people wait for the world to change so that they can finally feel at peace. They wait for the economy to new way to change, for people to change, for problems to disappear, for someone to give them recognition, love, or security. And while they wait for everything outside to improve, they spend entire years without realizing something fundamental. Many times, life begins to change when you change. And I'm not talking about a nice motivational phrase. I'm talking about something deeply real. Wow. Because when you change the way you interpret things, your suffering changes. When you change the way you respond, your relationships change. When you change your emotional discipline, your decisions change. And when your decisions change, your destiny changes. I learned this by observing people from different cultures and different life stories. Some had lived through very difficult situations, but they still had a different energy. They weren't perfect people. They weren't people without pain, but there was something different about them. They stopped waiting for the world to fall into place and began to transform themselves from within. And that gave them incredible strength, because many people want to results without becoming someone new, new. They want peace, but they continue to feed chaos. They want stability, but they react to everything. They want healthy relationships, but they don't work on their wounds. They want respect, but they don't control their emotions. And so life repeats itself over and over again. I remember times when I wanted certain circumstances to change so that I would feel better. I thought the problem was only external, but over time, I came to understand something uncomfortable. Even if you change places, jobs, or people, if you remain the same emotionally, you will often repeat the same patterns because the root remains intact. That is why there are people who change relationships, and encounter the same problem. They change their environment and feel the same frustration. They change their goal and continue to feel empty. The problem is not always what is external. Many times the problem is the way you are looking at, interpreting, and reacting to life. And here, something incredible happens. When you begin to change internally, the world around you also begins to respond differently. When you stop reacting impulsively, many arguments disappear. When you stop constantly seeking approval, certain people lose power over you. When you develop calm clarity and emotional discipline, you begin to make better decisions. And those decisions build a different life. Look at this carefully. The same situation that used to destroy you emotionally now barely manages to move you. Not because the world became softer, but because you became stronger. That is real transformation, and it doesn't happen overnight. It happens in small decisions repeated every day. When you choose to think differently, when you choose not to react the same way, when you choose to heal instead of continuing to blame, when you choose discipline, even if you don't feel like it emotionally, that's when true change begins. Because external life is often a reflection of what happens internally. A disordered mind creates more chaos. A stable mind creates better paths. An emotional and mature person stops destroying opportunities with momentary impulses, and that's when you understand something powerful. You don't need to control everything to transform your life. You need to start by controlling yourself. Because when you change the way you look. You change the way you respond. You change the energy you transmit. And little by little, you change everything you build around you. Because in the end, the greatest transformation doesn't happen when the world finally understands you. It happens when you finally learn to control yourself from within. And perhaps after hearing all this, someone still thinks, but it's not easy. And they're right, it's not easy. No one said it would be. It's not easy to stop reacting when something hurts you. It's not easy to stay calm when life seems to push you to the edge. It's not easy to control thoughts that you've been feeding for years. But there's also something important to say. Continuing to live dominated by everything external is much harder. Because living like this slowly wears you down, steals your energy, clarity, peace, and turns you into someone who depends too much on what others do, say, or think. And a life built on that emotional dependency never feels truly free. That's why change begins when you decide to take back control of your inner world. You don't need to become cold. You don't need to stop feeling. You don't need to pretend that nothing hurts you. You need to learn not to give so much power to every situation. There will be criticism. There will be rejection. There will be unfair moments. There will be people who will try to destabilize you. But there will also be a new version of you capable of standing firm in the midst of it all. And that version doesn't come into being overnight. It's built every time you choose to respond intelligently instead of reacting impulsively. It's built when you to protect your peace more than you want to be right. It is built when you understand that not everything deserves to enter your mind or stay in your heart. In the end, life changes when you change. And the day you stop acting like a victim of everything that happens outside, you begin to become the owner of what happens inside you. And that's when everything changes. Oh.